Today is January 29th, 2024. I'm David Berlind, and this is the Blockchain Journal podcast. Joining me today is Israel Mirsky. He is the co-founder or founding member and a director of something called the Pharma Collective. A Pharma Collective is what many people in the blockchain industry refer to as a DAO, or a decentralized autonomous organization. And we're going to learn a little bit more about what the Pharma Collective is, what it does, and how it can serve as a model for the other industries when it comes to applying blockchain to enterprise-grade applications. But first, I just want to point out that you'll see some QR codes throughout this video. Those codes are for you to either visit the Blockchain Journal website or to find Israel online. We'll put up his QR codes at the end of this video that show you where you can find him on his various social accounts, and also where you can find more videos like this one from Blockchain Journal. So thanks very much for joining us today, Israel. Great to have you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's start right off with the Pharma Collective. What is the Pharma Collective?
So the Pharma Collective is a nonprofit investing DAO focused on helping to enable human health. So we live in a moment where there is a real crisis in pharmaceutical pricing in this country, where there are drug shortages that affect everything from insulin to childhood chemotherapy drugs, and where the incentives in the ecosystem are really misaligned in ways that are enabling and creating those conditions. So we need to create new ways to incentivize actors within that ecosystem, within that business, to do the things that are necessary for human health and not just the things that drive the most profits for the individual extremely large companies involved.
Okay, I'm not very knowledgeable when it comes to the pharmaceutical industry, but I have done a fair amount of reading in the business press, and I'm going to try to kind of guess at what the problem here is, but I hope that maybe you'll elaborate a little bit more. So my understanding is that if there's a big enough market, enough people who are sick with some disease of some sort, then the drug manufacturers will invest the time, the money, and the effort to develop a drug because they see the potential of profit there. However, for those ailments that are rare, where research probably could unveil some sort of remedy, that work just doesn't take place because the different pharmaceutical companies don't see enough profit in the work. Is that essentially sort of framing the idea here?
It's a little bit more complicated than that because the numbers are so large. So basically, in the pharmaceutical world, almost all the investment flows downhill from a handful of companies, right? And those companies, because of their size and because of the amount of growth that they need to show to the market, need to make a really enormous amount of money from each new drug that they put through the approval process in order to justify their cost structures and that investment, right? So in order to justify a new drug, the large pharmas basically need to see at this point, about $2 billion a year for 20 years of patent-protected income in order to invest in a development effort. That is, taking a drug through the phase trials that would be necessary to get it approved by the FDA. And as a result, the nature of the drugs that they do this with are exclusively the most profitable drugs that they can identify, not necessarily the ones that would create the most impact on human health, because those things are not the same. And we'll talk about some other ways in which that's the case. But for example, just a couple of years ago, the vast majority of drugs that were being approved by the FDA, being taken through these phase trials, were, for example, oncology drugs that extended life by weeks to months. Or because of some of the other incentives that the FDA offers, orphan disease drugs, which these drug companies can get enormous sums from health systems for, but really only touch a very small number of people, and where there have been some incentives in place for getting those things through. Right.
What does that mean by orphaned? Like
an orphan drug? It's basically a drug that hits a disease for which there is no existing treatment.
I see. Okay.
Right. So, in the middle, though, there are all of these human health needs that are being underserved by pharmaceuticals, and all of these types of drug programs that don't get invested in, or are invested in and then killed because they threaten some existing large patent portfolio winner that a drug company has. So they'll buy drugs that are promising, and instead of investing and taking them through trials because they might be threatening, they'll just kill them because the investment isn't worth the squeeze compared to the money that they're already making and the money that they've already invested in those drugs versus the relative amount of time that they'd be on patent.
So there's some risk there. They buy the drug, they take a closer look at it, they decide that there's some risk associated with another drug manufacturer's intellectual property, and then they just abandon it because
not
it's not
even
worth the effort.
More like, imagine you buy a drug that you have a 20-year patent life on a leading antidepressant that you're making billions of dollars a year on, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a drug program that's looking for a buyer out on the marketplace that maybe has only 10 years or 7 years or 6 years worth of life on it, but it looks like it might be a better antidepressant than your winning drug. But it hasn't been through the phase trials, right, to make it approved by the FDA. Well, they may buy that drug and then kill the drug program, not take it through development, because it would be a threat to X number of years of their revenue on the existing winning drug.
I get it. All right. So
Right.
they don't want some drug that's only got 10 years left to cannibalize their profits on something else that maybe has 15 years left.
And there are a
18.
million different examples of this kind of thing where, like, if you are looking at it from a purely business perspective, then they're sensible business decisions. But if you're thinking about them from a human health perspective, they're terrible. And probably the biggest space for this is generic drugs, because there are over 10,000, over 20,000, depending on how you count, generic drugs that are generally recognized as safe, that've been through all the phase trials by the FDA, and no one will touch them to do additional trials on them to demonstrate that they're good for other things, because you can't make that kind of money. So, like, there's this huge, what you'd call low-hanging molecular fruit trove that's just underutilized by us as human beings, because it doesn't fit with the existing incentives within that marketplace. And that's part of what we can address with the Pharma Collective.
Okay. Now, the Pharma Collective is a DAO, decentralized autonomous organization. And before we get into exactly how the Pharma Collective solves for that particular problem that you're just describing, there are members of our audience who probably don't even know what a DAO is. So could you just describe the basics of a DAO?
Sure.
First?
So essentially, a decentralized autonomous organization, at its simplest, it's like a group chat with a wallet attached to it. So where essentially you have some community organization features, and then the community can, as a group, decide what to invest in using that shared wallet. So they come together, they put money in the kitty, and then as a group, they decide how that money is dispersed. That's the simplest example of a DAO. And on top of that, like, there can be many other DAO features, and DAOs are sort of styling themselves and slowly, I think, beginning to become a new kind of organization, like corporate-ish organization, in that it's a group of people coming together with shared goals in order to accomplish something, and using financial means, not a volunteer organization. And
Right.
Many of the earliest and most successful DAOs were investing clubs of one kind or another. There are certainly other types of things that exist now that are DAOs, but the investing club is a pretty well understood and version of a decentralized autonomous organization.
Is it safe to assume that somebody who joins a DAO like the Pharma Collective and throws money into the kitty, as you say, that they're looking to maximize their return on that investment?
Historically, yes. So in your ordinary investing DAO, that would be the case. Because what we're trying to accomplish here is really about human health as opposed to being about purely a profit motive. We're a nonprofit. No, at least as it's currently envisioned, no profits will flow back to organization members. to DAO members. What will instead happen is that the collective goals of that group will be driven forward. So whether that's helping to produce insulin, or that's helping to repurpose drugs, or helping to get various psychedelics approved for use in human beings, those are all goals that the group as a whole can undertake. And the other thing to keep in mind about this is there's a way for this to be very self-sustaining once we get going. So there's a model for nonprofits to subsidize and make impact as a group that we've seen trodden before. So the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation worked with Gilead to develop a drug for cystic fibrosis a few years ago, and they were successful, and the nonprofit ultimately was able to receive about $10 billion, as I've heard it in the final accounting, from Gilead for the investment that they made. If we accomplish even a small percentage of that, the amount of impact that we'll be able to have on global health is going to be really, really significant in some of the ways that I'll talk about in a few minutes when we talk about the nuts and bolts of what the Pharma Collective will do.
What is the incentive for somebody to join something where they're not expecting to maximize their return on investment? I mean, why are we looking at a category of people who this is just a very personal thing to, and so there's enough of them, you can get some money flowing to get behind some sort of drug development? I
think in this case that's the truth. So we've all been impacted by the state of our current health system. It's not working for a lot of people. And so I think this is a case where collective action, where people donating to a nonprofit that ultimately is not looking for them to donate forever, but is looking to create a self-sustaining approach to solving problems that are very intimately personal for them, not being able to get insulin, their kids not being able to get chemotherapy drugs, problems that are impacting millions of Americans. As soon as they hear that there's a way to address this as a group, people get very excited about it. So I think that's the opportunity here. I think in other places, there are models for doing this that are a little more hybrid. So think like a B Corp, where there's or a public benefit corporation, where there's a profit motive and a social motive. Mm-hmm. And we've evaluated and continue to evaluate whether or not there are ways to work with B Corps in order to accomplish some of these goals.
Okay, so if we think about the people for whom this is personal, do you need a certain critical mass of those people? Well, let me back up. Is the collective divided into categories of remedies or specific? For example, you mentioned insulin. Maybe there's a whole bunch of people who can't get insulin, and they see this as an avenue. So you have enough of those people who jump into the insulin part of the collective, then they can potentially get some insulin flowing for their family member or something like how does...
So the way to think about that is, yes, everybody has their own pet projects and needs, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And the kitty is only so large at any given time. So we have to decide which proposals get funded and which proposals don't get funded. And ultimately, that's the job of the DAO to help to do. So if you want the money from this collective treasury to flow in the direction of the areas that are most relevant for you, your job is to be as involved as possible, to spread that message as far as possible, and to get as many other people like you mm-hmm. to be part of the group, so that as a group you can impact that goal. And,
I see.
Yeah.
So the different people who are contributing, if you can find enough people, if there's like a chat group out there, or a Facebook group or something, where there's tons of people who all kind of see a common problem, common cause in the drug development industry, they might all kind of get together and say, hey, this is a pretty good option. Let's all get in there. Let's all contribute some amount of money. And then they also have some influence over the governance of how the money from the collective is spent and maybe allocated to that particular drug development.
That's correct. So, mm-hmm. for example, last year, there were some really major shortages of children's Advil and Tylenol, acetaminophen and ibuprofen, and if this had been up and running at that point, parents could have gotten together very readily, contribute a few bucks, and fix the shortage problem in this country. A big part of the reason that occurs is because the margins for pharmaceutical generic production tend to be quite thin. And so companies have to make bets about where they're going to spend their time and effort in order to successfully produce the necessary drugs. You do something like this and you essentially de-risk that process, because the Dow can basically give a loan to the producing company to produce the drug, and they know they have a market for it. And the risk is really limited to both parties. You've basically de-risked the transaction of producing those generic drugs for that market within that environment.
So
in a sustainable way, because you're not donating. You're not saying like, oh, here's a donation for producing my Advil or my acetaminophen. You're acting like a little bit like a bank, but definitely like an investing organization that removes risk from the equation of generics manufacturing.
Why would the company that normally produces that not already be doing it if there's a sufficient market for it? Like if there's this many people who are willing to contribute to a Dow, wouldn't some producer of generic ibuprofen see that and say, okay, there's something here? I mean, why would they actually have to go get a loan from a Dow? Why can't they get a loan from a bank or somebody else? Why does this have to exist through blockchain and a Dow versus any other traditional finance structure?
I mean, I think it probably could. You probably could get a loan from a bank, but it might be a lot more difficult to justify that loan. And we can probably give better terms than the bank loan could. Because,
I see. Oh, so there's a market. There's enough parents who are worried about this, and they're committed. Whereas a bank could care less.
Exactly. It's just like, hey, what's the interest rate you're going to give me on this loan, right? Well, right. We don't care. Like it's a self-sustaining effort. We want to make some small level of profit in order to continue growing the momentum of the effort. But ultimately, if it's important enough, like that doesn't really matter, right? Like what really matters to us is the human health goal that's associated, right? And that's what really sets this apart. That's why it's valuable for us to have a mission that is human health focused as opposed to purely profit focused. Because when you focus purely on profit, you end up in the places where we've ended up. Your values are misaligned with your needs.
And of course, the bank's going to not only look at the interest rate they can make, but they're going to look at the actual business what it is that's being developed, and they're going to make some decisions about the viability of just that product in the market, or
try to, if they're even sophisticated enough to do so. So let's talk about some of the other things that we can do here, right? Because production subsidization is the lowest hanging fruit and the first thing that we're definitely going to do. But like above that, there's a whole universe of other things that we can do. So let's talk about repurposing for a minute. So my co-founder, Gennaro D'Urso, he has a company called Genetic Networks out of Florida. They focus on drug discovery using yeasts. So he started the company with a Nobel Prize winner, and some of that Nobel Prize winner's subsequent work focuses on this idea called modular biology. Essentially, you can use yeasts to screen drugs for efficacy in human beings, right? It's a very effective, high-fidelity technique. Now, during the pandemic, very quickly after it became clear that this was going to be a global pandemic, Genetic Networks screened 7 drugs using their technology, identified 7 drugs that were very likely to be efficacious for reducing hospitalization in COVID. And subsequently, they were able to show that 2 of those drugs in combination actually did reduce hospitalization by over 53%. Could have had a massive effect on the global pandemic, right?
Sure.
When they took these opportunities to pharmaceutical companies, they couldn't get anyone interested in doing the phase trials to demonstrate whether or not this was actually true, to test these drugs for efficacy. Why? Because they were generics. Because no one could make enough money from producing them. They were not investigated. And as a result, we suffered through far more deaths than we otherwise would have had to do, right? that infuriated my partner and really catalyzed the repurposing focused mission part of this. So there are, as I said, over 10,000 generic drugs that are generally recognized as safe, many of which are good for other things than what they were originally studied for, but no one will touch them. So we need an entity and a means of investing in those drugs in ways that make sense for human health.
So we'll take the low-hanging fruit first was just, hey, there's a market that's living and there's enough of a market for something and nobody's recognizing it. The banks don't want to fund it. So this can help get...
We've got shortages. We've got a way to address the shortages. Let's deal with that. That's the simplest thing. But the level above that is really impactful for human health, right? It's like, so because generic drugs have already been through all 3 phases of FDA trials, if you want to prove that they're good for something else, you don't have to do phases 1 and 2. You can just do a phase 3 trial. You can say, all right, I think that this drug is good for heart disease, right? Based on the fact that it's being used off-label for heart disease all over the place, right? But no one will pay for it within the health system because it isn't proven or what have you, right? Just as
insurance companies, for example, insurance company won't pay for the medication because it hasn't been improved
because it's off-label. Ketamine is actually a perfect example of this, right? So ketamine is being widely used off-label for treatment-resistant depression, to the point where there's clinics across the country, like people in my family included, who have been positively impacted by ketamine, which is a generic drug for treatment-resistant depression and for postpartum, like magic, right? But the insurance companies will not cover it because there is not enough, like no one has done the work to get it through the phase 3 trials for treatment-resistant depression.
Just need a phase 3 trial and you're done.
And there are some efforts to do that. So if you do that, if you do it and you do it in a particular form, you can get something called a 505(b)(2) patent from the FDA, which is not a 20-year patent that's exclusive for any use of the drug. It's just a temporary patent that gets you 3 to 7 years for that form and that condition. And with that patent, you can make tens to hundreds of millions of dollars producing that treatment for that issue, but you can't make billions, right? With this comes the opportunity for a repurposing model that is publicly responsible, because we can take a drug that is a generic drug that we know is safe for use in humans. We can get it approved by running a phase 3 trial on it for a couple $1 million. Like your average phase 3 trial is $2 to $20 million, and if you're really smart about it and you use telehealth and some of the things that we developed during the pandemic to do things like administer the medication, you can really drop a lot of those costs. Half of all trial costs are site costs. So like just bringing people physically to a place, and when you cut that out, you can really reduce the amount of cost for doing this. You run that trial and you get that temporary patent, and then you reinvest those profits in doing it over and over and over again. We can create an engine for drug development in the public interest that does not exist in the current ecosystem.
It's not even drug development; it's just drug testing. Quite frankly, like it's
so. In this world, we refer to like finding the substance as discovery, and we refer to taking it through phase trials, like 1, 2, and 3, and then production as development. Those are sort of the way that language is used. Yeah, the vocabulary of the terms of art, right? So like, you know, a lot of people talk about DSci in this space. We really think of ourselves as DDev, and DSci as being sort of that primary like substance identification thing. And what we're doing is really about like taking stuff to market.
So I imagine that this is going to get even crazier, because one of the things that I heard about recently, I believe it was on NPR, was that artificial intelligence can like very quickly, some of the better artificial intelligence can very quickly identify some of these mixtures of drugs that are likely to solve a problem, or even molecular, like, I don't know anything about the field, the science, but literally the artificial intelligence can discover the probability of some new molecular combination that had never been attempted before, and its efficacy against some particular disease, like so much faster and so much more cheaply than anything else that's in existence today.
It's so exciting. It's a really exciting moment in that space, and actually the combination of that technology I was talking about before from genetic networks, that raw data combined with artificial intelligence is a really powerful combination together, because, of course, living biological systems are incredibly complex, right? So part of the challenge with artificial intelligence has been like that the level of complexity can be so high that unless you have a truly enormous amount of data about the genetic response of various genes to given pharmaceutical compounds, like you don't have the right kind of data to make the right kind of inference about what's actually happening. But we do see a huge opportunity coming up in that space. The problem is going to continue being the case that, like, even when we identify good opportunities, unless they're patentable in the way that they will result in what we just discussed, $40 billion worth of revenue, and as that continues to go up as inflation increases, they're not going to be researched. So we need publicly responsible investing organizations that have goals that aren't just that, in order to bring the type of human health impact that we want to see from artificial intelligence to the marketplace and to the people.
Okay, we talked all the way through this. So we talked about the low-hanging fruit, maybe I don't know, is there any more
high-hanging
above
fruit?
The...
Yeah. So the high-hanging fruit, right? The high-hanging fruit is competitive on patent drugs. So, like, if you you're gonna subsidize the production, you're gonna repurpose generics, and then once you have a sufficient, like, let's say we are successful with 2 or 3 different programs, or several different programs at the multi-$100 million level, right? Or we get like a really big donation from a wealthy individual who's seeing the impact that we're having, right? At that point,
or who has a relative, right?
Like, or has a relative, right? That they want to get something researched.
They'll do anything.
They'll do anything, right? So at that point, you can do development from phase 1 through phase 3. So, I have a lot of suspicions about the reasons that some of these drugs cost so much to get through phase trials, and some of it might be regulatory capture. Some of it is probably just that it serves these companies to have high expenses in some of these spaces, because it allows them to help to justify the costs that they ultimately charge on the other side.
Right.
But like, if you can take a drug from absolutely off patent to on patent that serves a lot of people, then now we're talking about billions of dollars.
Now
we're talking about billions of dollars into a nonprofit focused on human health, not profit, right?
And you talked about the math earlier. You said that it was like I want to say $2 billion a year for 20 years or something like that. That's where you get the $40 billion. But that number is just going to keep going up over.
Absolutely,
and we're at a moment in time.
It's a huge chunk of our spending as a society on pharmaceuticals, and the vast majority of the spend is on patent drugs, not on generics. So it's like 95.5 or something crazy like that. Even though, like, the prescription, like, in terms of the amount of drugs that we take, that's completely flipped. So
for our audience, when we talk about a DAO, so I think we understand the basic structure here. Can you help them to understand where blockchain plays a role?
Sure.
In a DAO?
So blockchain essentially allows us to democratize the voting around how the treasury is deployed. So it's actually a 2-stage process where we have, because we're not expecting our members to be able to vet the proposals that are coming through effectively, right? Like, your average person can't decide between, like, a scam and a real proposal. But we have, we started this company, this nonprofit, with some really sophisticated scientists and researchers. So we have volunteers who can function in an advisory role to review the proposals that come through and identify the ones that are real across a bunch of dimensions in terms of financial viability and whether or not the companies involved are reputable, etc. So those that are real come through for an up-down vote by the rest of the DAO group. And that's where your insulin community versus your childhood chemotherapy community versus your other community, your ketamine community or what have you, that's where that comes into play. And they decide, like, okay, which one are we going to do next? How are we deploying the treasury now? Right.
So the treasury is the money that's going in. It's probably going in, and then there's a token that's associated with the DAO. it's a governance token. You get to vote
we're
with
actually
that, right?
we plan to do governance NFTs because one of our
Okay.
our at least at the moment, like one of our fundraising approaches that we're exploring is collaborations with artists. So like you could get like a real digital artist whose art has value by virtue of their previous work, doing a collaborative collection with us where like your entrance NFT is their thing, right? Is their piece of digital art, and we split the proceeds, and it's basically partly a donation from them to us and partly a collaborative marketing effort.
I see. So just so people understand the mechanics, you have some U.S. dollars. You have to go to an exchange, maybe trade that in for the token that we're talking about.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah.
Essentially, yes. Like you're probably going to need at least USDC. Although, like some of these platforms now will enable you to purchase more directly with USD via like a Square-based on-ramp.
I see.
But so we're trying to make that as painless as possible going forward.
And are you on a particular blockchain?
I am not able to disclose that at this time.
Oh, okay. So yeah, we're not up and running yet.
So we're running in terms of we're taking donations. Our white paper's done. We're actively working with companies that would be the first few proposals associated with funding, and we're very actively working against fundraising with high net worth individuals because that would be very helpful within this environment to rapidly get up and running. But in terms of the voting logic, that is not yet complete. And as you would imagine, there are several L1s and L2s who, like, look, this starts to do what we're talking about doing here, and it changes the whole conversation around blockchain. Because like the discussion of like, oh, this is only good for money laundering, or this is like the technology is not mature enough to have a real impact on the world. Well, we start producing insulin, we start producing childhood chemotherapy drugs, and it's because a DAO is helping to direct these kinds of funds against human health goals, like, and we build a drumbeat of those stories. We're repurposing medications, like that completely changes the discussion. And
sure, because right now blockchain has a pretty good PR problem, right?
Right, exactly.
Not helped by crypto or anything like that, or Sam Bankman-Fried. But so let's we understand blockchain, we understand a DAO, we understand the application here and the cause. It seems very noble, not quite off the ground yet. So where can people find more about this? So
go to pharmacollective.io. We also have a Pharma Collective on Twitter and Instagram, but just go to the website, sign up for the mailing list. We will keep you apprised of all the developments, and we are very actively working with some L2s to make a lot of progress quickly. As you can imagine, those grant programs are very interesting from the perspective of getting something like this off the ground. And
so you're looking for maybe some investment from the L2s or the L1s that have
L1s or L2s that have large treasuries, because like really like we're going to start making a significant impact. You need some money to get started, but once it's running, because this is a self-sustaining engine here, right? We don't necessarily need to keep taking on additional dollars, but we kickstart this and it's going to start moving pretty quickly.
You mentioned, we talked about the PR problem that we're dealing with. I just wrote a whole article about that, by the way, Lawmakers and Business Person's Guide to the Non-Crypto Applications of Blockchain, and talked a little bit about the PR problem that blockchain has and how it's so tightly associated with crypto and all the bad news about crypto. Kind of like, so what other industries, I mentioned that we're going to talk about this, and this is an interesting model. Everybody can understand it. I think everybody's got as you pointed out, we all have somebody in our family who is suffering from something, and we feel like there could be more done to address it, more in the way of drugs. And boy, oh boy, I think a lot of people would be upset to learn, oh, wait a minute, there's actually a better drug that could be done, but it's been killed because of the profit situation or something like that's, you just feel robbed when you hear that, whether you're a family member or the patient themselves. So where else does this sort of dynamic exist where you think DAOs could apply?
I think any place where the incentives are really dramatically against the small or mid-sized players.
Is there another example of that besides the pharmaceutical industry? There must be something. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I'm sure you think about this every day.
So I do spend the vast majority of my time thinking about the healthcare implications of this.
Yeah.
But I think we've seen a bunch of DAOs. So like, if you want to collectively invest in something where there is like, you can't effectively compete against larger players as
renewable energy development.
Renewable energy development. Great example, right?
Yeah.
So we need to be able to effectively purchase against a large player in the industry as a group of individual manufacturers. We need silicone, or we need panels, right? Like, I think DAO organizations for small and mid-sized players that essentially function as like Groupon for industry are a really interesting potential application.
I mean, we're really just talking about an alternative channel for philanthropic effort to take place than in this
case, it doesn't even necessarily have to be philanthropic, right? It can just be about aggregating buying power and investing power in ways that are good for entities to work as a group, where nobody has to be the leader in that way that it's historically been the case, right?
Right.
So like, let's say in that space, you've got like a massive solar player, right? Who can, as a result of their size, can purchase panels for vastly less than any of the smaller players, right? But if you aggregated all the small installers together, they'd be as large or bigger than that player. So how do you help those small installers get the prices that the big player's getting?
Well, you want to get like a cooperative going.
Exactly. You need some kind of cooperative. Well, historically, like, whoever runs that cooperative has an undue amount of influence over the impact and too much information versus the other players. Well, the DAO sort of fixes that problem, right? Because
nobody's in charge.
Nobody's in charge. It creates a voting mechanism where everybody's participating transparently in the decision about how to deploy that cash, right? So that group of manufacturers can get together and transparently negotiate together for the kinds of deals that the larger player is getting, right? I think about trade length. Right,
yeah. You probably heard of that. Mm-hmm. Right, the whole thing went down. Didn't work out because two companies were in control of the whole thing. It was a whole idea of forming a cooperative in the supply chain industry. But the problem was that still two companies controlled the whole thing. IBM and Maersk, and so therefore a lot of other companies that might have otherwise participated were like, wait a minute, those two companies get an unfair amount of undue influence over the whole decision making. Imagine if that had been a much more democratized process, then you might have seen many more companies get involved.
And it still could, right? That's still an opportunity. I think blockchain and DAOs have only just begun to sort of penetrate the market. Like, the great promise of blockchain has always been remove middleman, right? Remove rent-seeking middleman. And I think like there's a version of that is remove or reduce the power of like massive industry distorting player, right?
I like that. Remove rent-seeking middlemen. That's a really good metaphor to use when you're talking to people about the value proposition of blockchain.
Exactly. Anytime you're looking at your industry and you're thinking to yourself like, okay, where does blockchain apply? Figure out in between you and your customer, or you and your supplier, who's extracting the most rent along those chains, right? There's almost certainly an application for blockchain in there somewhere. So where's the rent? Yeah. That's where you'll see where the opportunity is for blockchain.
Disintermediate the middleman.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, Israel Mirsky, you're the co-founder and or one of the founding members.
Co-founder.
Co-founder and director of the Pharma Collective. We'll put up some contact information for the Pharma Collective and for you. Thank you very much for joining us on the Blockchain Journal podcast.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the time. Looking forward to more from all of your members.
Thank you very much. You've been listening to the Blockchain Journal podcast. I'm your host, David Berlin. For more videos like this one, you can go to our YouTube channel. We're easy to find at youtube.com/ I think it's at Blockchain Journal. You can also find us, of course, at blockchainjournal.com, where all of our videos are not only posted, but the full text transcript of the interview can be found there. And you can also find us on all the different podcast services like Spotify. So you go on any podcast service, you'll be able to listen to the audio of this on your train ride or in your car, however you want to do it, or this and all other videos. So thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next podcast.